The number of people sleeping rough on London streets has continued to accelerate, rising 29% in the space of just a year. A total of 4,223 people were recorded as sleeping rough between April and June this year, the combined Homelessness and Information Network chain found. The figures, which cover the last full quarter up to the July general election, show the number of people on the English capital streets rose 33% in the past 5 years, despite promises from the Conservatives to end rough sleeping. The inside story of how Tony Blair's new Labour all but ended rough sleeping. Number of women sleeping rough on England Street may be 9 times higher than government thinks. Frontline homelessness charities called on the Labour government to take urgent action to prevent rising rough sleeping, including appointing a homelessness minister and setting up a promised cross-government unit to tackle the issue. Matt Downey, chief executive at Crisis, said it's shameful that thousands of people are being forced to bed down on the capital streets, moving between night buses or staying awake in doorways and 24-hour cafes. No one should have to face this level of danger. This bleak reality for over 4,000 people must change. We urgently need a unit for ending homelessness to be established, backed by the Prime Minister and engaging with regional mayors to deliver a strategy on tackling homelessness. This would provide overdue coordination across government to bring us closer to a future free from homelessness. We stand ready to work with the government to achieve this. Mayor of London Sadiq Khan has vowed to end rough sleeping by 2030 at Target. The Big Issues blueprint for change is called to be extended to the rest of the country. But huge rises in the chain statistics show just how far away that ambition is. As well as the 29% total rise in rough sleepers across London, there was a 20% increase in the number of people sleeping rough for the first time compared to the same period last year. A total of 624 people were deemed to be living on the streets long-term, up 52% in a year. A further 1,740 were found by outreach teams to be intermittently rough sleepers. That's 35% higher than last year. Youth homelessness charity Centrepoint's Dr. Tom Carriage described a 36% rise in the number of young people aged under 25 as really worrying. Joe Carter, chief executive of Glassdoor Homeless Charity, said efforts to prevent the number of renters from losing their homes are needed to stop people from ending up on London's streets. The latest chain report should be a clear sign that action is needed. Far too many people continue to be left without a safe and secure home, and this issue will not get better on its own, said Carter. We are encouraged by the new government's renters' rights bill proposed in the King's Speech. Our message to the government is this: show that you are serious about tackling homelessness. Push the bill forward as a top priority, ban no-fault evictions, and limit rent increases without any delays or loopholes. It's in your power to give tenants more security in their homes and slow down the flow of people from the private rental sector into homelessness. A damning report from the National Audit Office released last week, which did not focus on rough sleeping, warned wider homelessness is set to rise across England in the months ahead. The situation has now reached epidemic proportions. Rick Henderson, chief executive at Homeless Link, the national membership body for Frontline homelessness services, said whether it's rough sleeping, temporary accommodation, or sofa surfing, England faces a homelessness epidemic. But we know it can be solved through government homelessness and community organization collaboration. Drawing on sector expertise, we will be making sure our policy asks are heard. Labour has, so far, yet to confirm which minister will lead on the homelessness brief. Emma Haddad Saint, Mungo's chief executive, said the charity is looking forward to seeing who will lead the government's efforts in bringing their commitment to ending homelessness to life. Nick Redmore, director of the Salvation Army's Homeless Services, said bringing an end to homelessness can be the Labour government's legacy. We look forward to working with the new government to ensure everyone has a home, but in order to do this, homelessness services need to be properly funded. The government must also deliver a sustained investment and increase in housing stock, especially social housing, to meet the needs of the growing numbers of people experiencing homelessness. A government spokesperson said tackling homelessness and rough sleeping means addressing the deep-rooted issues that cause it. That is why we will develop a cross-government strategy so we can work with mayors and councils, including those in London, to get us back on track to ending homelessness for good. Homelessness is a massive problem in the UK. In total, it is expected that the number of people who are homeless in the UK is approximately 300,000 households, almost 1 in 100. Homelessness does not just include those who you see on the streets rough sleeping, but also those in temporary accommodation, sofa surfing, or in unsafe housing. Huge increases in the cost of living, which we have all felt but which are especially difficult for people on low incomes. They have found themselves having to choose between paying the rent or buying food. People have gotten behind on their bills and rent and have been evicted. There aren't enough affordable homes, and people are forced to live in poor quality, very expensive private housing. We need to end no-fault evictions, and DePaul, UK and other charities have been calling on government to do this, but it hasn't happened yet. The cost of living crisis, sky-high rents, and the lack of affordable social housing have created a perfect storm. And for young people, it's even tougher because their minimum wage and their benefits are lower. The Independent National Audit Office has sharply criticized the former conservative government for having no strategy or public targets for reducing homelessness and for falling behind on plans to boost housing supply. The Now issued the report at the end of last week, covering the last 2 years or so of conservative governments. The Now accepts that homelessness is a highly complex issue affected by a wide range of social and economic factors and by government policy in areas such as housing, welfare, and asylum. But it says that statutory homelessness has increased significantly in recent years, meaning that more people are finding themselves either with no stable place to live or in temporary accommodation provided by their local authority. Providing temporary accommodation alone cost local authorities over PS $1.6 billion in 2002-2023, but it varies in quality and there are gaps in regulation, while some of it, such as BBS being used for households with children, is unsuitable. Dealing with homelessness is creating unsustainable financial pressure for some local authorities, warns the Audit Office. Poverty undoubtedly increases the risk of homelessness. Today in the UK, there are 4.3 million children living in poverty. In many cases, homeless young people leave home because their families cannot afford to look after them. It's in this transition where young people are at increased risk of homelessness. The rise in costs of living, coupled with barriers to accessing the right social support or housing for young adults, makes it harder to find long-term accommodation. Approximately 100,000 young people age out of the care system each year in England. These young care leavers are often left to set up their own homes alone. They go without the support networks or skills, such as money management, they need to thrive. According to the Department for Education, in 2021-22, there were 45,940 care leavers in England, now aged 17 to 21. Centrepoint research has shown that 26% of care leavers have sofa surfed and 14% have slept rough. The misconceptions of homelessness. Many believe the level of homelessness is much lower than it is, as often only rough sleepers are considered to be homeless. However, the definition is much broader than that. Whilst rough sleeping is the most obvious and visible form of homelessness, there are also many people who are considered statutory homeless. This includes those who are in temporary housing or shelter provided by local authorities. Every year, tens of thousands apply to their local authority for homelessness assistance. Many do receive this, however, there are strict guidelines that must be met to stay in many forms of temporary accommodation. Many who are homeless are hidden and never counted in official statistics. Due to the stigma placed on being homeless, many will never approach their council for assistance and will stay in hostels or with friends and family for as long as they can. It is estimated 4,677 people are sleeping rough on the streets of England, which is actually a small percentage of the overall crisis, but is still too high a number. Why we're in crisis? There are many reasons why the UK faces the homelessness crisis it currently finds itself in. Many people find themselves without a home due to social and familial reasons. Others can due to mental and physical health problems. Many people find themselves homeless after leaving prison or the army, and many women are homeless after fleeing abusive relationships. It's a complex issue that can't be boiled down to fit in a 1,000-word article. Homelessness is more than a lack of home. Are we failing to listen to people? To understand people? However, with rising rent costs and a lack of rent control policies, many simply cannot afford to pay for the roof over their head anymore. The area with the highest rate of homelessness is Newham, London, with 1 in 24 facing homelessness. It is unsurprising that the most expensive city to live in the UK and Europe is the city with the biggest problem. The decrease in social housing has had a distinct effect on homelessness. Between the early 1980s and early 2010s, the proportion of the population living in social housing halved. This can be traced to the option of right to buy and a decrease in social housing construction. Decisions made by the government in the 80s were extremely short-sighted, and whilst they solved problems which may seem minor and temporary now, the negative effects are still being felt now, over 30 years later. NPC believe there are 5 systematic factors that drive increasing homelessness. Low-pay unemployment is falling. Read more, however. 57% of those in poverty are living in a house where someone is in paid work. Low levels of house building. 227,000 new households are required to be constructed a year. However, construction is falling short of this figure. Less social housing. Many governments have shifted their focus to affordable rent. However, the rent is set at a level affordable for households with middle incomes. Welfare reform. Universal credit, amongst other reforms, has had a major effect on people able to gain stable, paid accommodation. Austerity and cuts to local authority budgets. Funding for local authorities has fallen around 50% since 2010. Funding is being cut for services all over, and the trickle-down effect is more left in housing insecurity. What is being done? The government has dedicated PS1000 million to tackle rough sleeping on the streets of England. Housing Secretary James Brokenshire has also vowed to make homelessness a thing of the past, and the government has vowed to end rough sleeping by 2027. According to the BBC, Polly Nate, chief executive of Shelter, has warned this is a step forward, but not a total fix. In Nottingham, Labour councillor Linda Wooding said to the BBC, until 2010 we received a PS26M grant for this sort of work, when it was scrapped altogether. We didn't have the levels of rough sleeping that we see now when we had properly funded support in place. Under capitalism, prices are supposed to be the center of everything. They are the key agreement between buyer and seller. They are the one clear and reliable piece of information on which the whole often opaque and unstable system depends. So it struck me as strange when some of my local London shops stopped displaying the prices of some goods a couple of years ago. It started with upmarket fishmongers, and I wondered whether this was because wealthy customers didn't need to count their pennies. But then the practice spread to corner shops and greengrocers with a wider clientele, and to everyday purchases such as fruit and vegetables. There was a cost of living crisis going on, the worst in Britain for 40 years, but parts of Hackney seem to be in denial. 2 years of relentless price rises later, much of the rest of the country still seems in denial as well. Inflation is falling but remains higher in Britain than many comparable nations. Yet opinion polls regularly show that roughly a third of Britons mistakenly believe that falling inflation means falling prices in general rather than prices merely rising more slowly. In part, his upbeat statements about inflation can be explained as political desperation, although much less the result of his policies than of global factors, such as the reduction of price pressures from the war in Ukraine. The falling rate is one of the few successes his premiership can claim. Despite usually being a leader with startlingly little feel for what voters think, Sunak's stance on inflation is in tune with some of the public, at least in a psychological sense. The cost of living crisis has created a new economic reality in Britain, which many of us haven't fully appreciated yet, or simply don't want to face. Apart from a few commodities sold by highly competitive retailers such as butter and milk, most goods are not falling in price, and the cost of services is still rising rapidly by the standards of recent decades by 6% a year. According to the latest figures from the Office for National Statistics ONS, at best, the cost of living has reached a new plateau, where the air is thinner and the landscape bleaker for anyone whose income has not kept pace with inflation since it began to climb in early 2021. There are almost certainly harsher plateaux to come. Our farmers are warning that food prices will rise after a long period of record-breaking rain. The freeze in income tax thresholds means higher rates for millions. Council tax is increasing at an unprecedented pace. Meanwhile, the slow-motion collapse of Thames Water suggests a huge bill is on its way, either to its 16 million customers in southern England or to taxpayers in general. Misconceived privatizations, the climate crisis, the strained finances of both local and national government. British inflation is the product of both huge global forces and bad policy choices. 2 years ago, an ONS study of British inflation since 1950 found that, while its infamous surge in the 1970s was largely caused by sharp increases in world prices for food and other commodities, since 1989 the biggest driver has typically been housing and household services, which includes gas and electricity prices. By doing so much during the 1980s to create today's property-obsessed, profiteering economy, Margaret Thatcher did not defeat British inflation, as she promised, but made it worse in the long run instead. Until a government begins to address the unsatisfied desires and vested interests that sustain this inflation, for example, by undercutting the house-building giants with a program of cheaper homes, then Britain is probably going to remain an expensive place to live. For the rich, this probably won't matter much, if at all, judging by how they have continued to spend freely in the priciest parts of Britain throughout the cost of living crisis. For the poor, inflation has worsened the social emergency already caused by austerity, widespread ill health, and stagnant wages. Meanwhile, for those who live somewhere between those two extremes, consumerism has changed, possibly for good. Instead of instant gratification, ubiquitous offers of 10% extra free and untaxed EU imports. Shopping has become about carefully comparing prices, paying customs duties, and finding shrunken products slyly hidden inside the same packaging. The feeling of consumer power that millions of middle-income British consumers once enjoyed has gone. It was partly built on the powerlessness of factory workers and poorer,